Afternoon session, and it's a pleasure to introduce Guillaume Blacher, and he's from the Bank of America Merrill Lynch. He's going to tell us about Chayette, calibration, and fixed point methodology. So,
okay,
please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you can hear me? Okay, so yeah, today I'll present something a bit more practical. I mean, obviously I worked with Bruno for the first 5 years of my career, but that was already almost 19 years ago, I think. So it's been a while, but what I wanted to do today is present something that is both very practical in a sense, very relevant to what we do still in banking, at least what I do, and something that we apply in real life, but also something that shows some major influence from Bruno's work. So you'll see a couple of things that are, one thing which is very, very simple, the fixed point methodology. Obviously, I don't think necessarily Bruno invented that in a general sense, but the way we use it certainly was something that he inspired, and we tried many times in the early years. And I've been reusing quite successfully. Well, maybe 10 years later, when I presented my first stochastic volatility model, mixed model, and then more recently, even more successfully. And the other thing is the sigma zero expansion, which I'll use to derive some proxies. So I'll explain quickly the context, and then I'll speak about the fixed point algorithm, which is really simple and intuitive, and we'll show some examples and some application to FX smiles, although I'll show also some equity examples. And the main applications will be in the context of a much more complex model, and you'll see that it works quite well. There's obviously a joint work with a bunch of my people. So just to set the challenge, what we have practically is we give ourselves a complicated diffusion for the asset. I mean, I have not been very specific here, but you could think of ST as the FX spot rate or an equity spot rate, for example. And we'll have some sort of drift, which is generally determined by, locked down by martingale arguments. But the volatility form will be much more free. And as an example, you'll have maybe a local volatility form. So sigma of ST and T is the deterministic function of spot and time. But then you can throw in other things like psi t, for example, could be a stochastic volatility process with its own randomness. You could also have other kinds of adjustments in addition to the local vol. For example, some special days adjustments, L of t. You could potentially add jumps as well. And also the interest rate could be also have its own diffusion, and we'll show some examples of that. So this R itself could be a multi-factor rates model, or the difference of two multi-factor rates model. So typically, if you give yourself something like that, effectively, you live now in a Monte Carlo world because you have too many factors for almost anything else. And if you want to be really pricing complicated options, generally you end up in a Monte Carlo world. It's not particularly difficult to just write the diffusion, okay? And just to code it up and do some prices, but you need now to estimate the parameters. And one thing I'll mention, and actually is very important, is yes, we write this in Monte Carlo engine, but we also use GPU encoding, so leveraging the graphics cards, to have very, very fast Monte Carlo. Yeah. And this is quite important because not only it just means your Monte Carlo pricer, the pricer works faster than it would have 10 years ago, so you save a bit of time and that's it. It means a lot more. It means that there are certain things that basically were not possible to do 10 or 20 years ago, and suddenly are possible to do, and you open new doors. And hopefully I'll be able to show you that later on. So typically we have a number of model parameters. We have market observable. We have a pricer, in this case Monte Carlo, which is giving us the price from the parameters, but really what we want is go the other way for the calibration. How do we estimate the parameters from the observable prices? Ideally, it would be an analytical approximation that we could use to calibrate. And often we have some decent proxies to try to get approximation. We can ignore certain things, ignore stochastic rates or even stochastic vol. We could assume all sorts of additiveness, maybe when it's not perfectly true. We could compute quantities at the forward, etc. There's a whole bunch, and lots of very strong people in the market. Some of them in this room have spent a lot of time doing this. When you find such a proxy, you could do two things typically. You could say, well, I'm just going to calibrate using the proxy and hope that it's good enough. And often we do that. You have a decent proxy, you use it to calibrate, and then you just price for that, and hopefully you measure the error, and it's not too bad. Or what you could do is you could say, well, I use my proxy to get my initial guess, but then I'm going to put my pricer in a much heavier brute force solver, like type Newton type, or some best fit kind of solver like Levenberg Mark I, etc. But I think what I want to explain today is that if you have a decent proxy, surely there is information that should be used more than once and should be used iteratively through the process, because it tells you something that you don't want to just use to get your initial guess. So let's see what I mean by that. And it's very intuitive. So I don't really claim that it's totally revolutionary, but I have to admit that every time I look back and refresh the numbers and look again, I'm just always blown away by how well it works. So hopefully you'll be impressed as well. So fixed point algorithm, and I remember Bruno coming up with this idea many years ago, and we did a few applications. I think we were still at Paribas, so it would have been like 96, 97 with some stochastic local vol mix. And I think your explanation was like this. You want to throw an arrow at a target, and your arrow has a little thing to put your eye on, and then you point at the target, and then you notice that it goes 10 centimeters too low. Okay, so what do? Well, you just point 10 centimeters higher and hope you'll hit it, and maybe it will be now half a centimeter too high, correct, etc. And this is just what that does. So you start with the target is the market prices that you want to calibrate to, and let's call it target 1, and then you're going to use a proxy. So here what we have is we have a very slow function f that we don't know how to invert. We don't know f inverse. But we have a decent approximation of f, which is called g. And let's say that g can be inverted, or either exactly or quite fast. Okay? And we'll try to leverage g at every iteration. So we start by inverting g with the initial target, and we get x. Then we calculate f of x with the true function, the exact pricer, and we get a certain value. And if all was perfect, that value would reprice our target. Okay. In practice, there'll be some error, e, which is the difference between the f of x and the target, and we're just going to correct the target by the same amount. Okay, and do it again. Seems very simple, and doesn't seem to be much magic in that. But when we're going to start using it for more and more complex example, you see that actually it's quite powerful. Okay. So just to give a very basic illustration of this, let's pick a case where we have an asset S, let's say an equity asset, and we put a very silly or very simple stochastic rates process, or a Hohenly process. So the interest rate R as its own diffusion. Yeah? And they might be correlated. And we want to calibrate the sigma of S, so the term structure of volatility for the asset, to a set of observable implied vol at discrete times. Okay, so that's the other thing I want to insist on is the practitioner situation is that I have a discrete set of observables. I do not have a fully continuous implied vols. And really, I don't want to inject any more assumption. I just want a model that will calibrate to those and nothing more. The model is the way I'm going to interpolate my local vols. That is the assumption. So what is the term structure of local vol to match these ones? Okay, we have a pricer that prices perfectly with that model. Could be analytical, PDE, or Monte Carlo, whichever pricer. But let's say it's a slow pricer, okay, in quotes. And that let us go from sigma S to sigma, but not the other way. And let's say we don't know any proxy, we don't know any smart analytics with Ho and Lee, we are very naive, but we know about how to calculate Black-Scholes forward volatility. So what we're going to say, we're just going to use the standard forward vol function, and given the two implieds, we'll just estimate the local vol with that formula, which you'll all recognize. And what we'll do is we'll say this is our proxy. And if it's slightly wrong at the first iteration, we'll just do it 2 or 3 times by correcting the target, as I've explained. So what we see, the targets are in the second column. The first guess are in the third column, called guess 1. And then we price properly, and we get implied 1. And then we see the errors. So it's not too bad, but there are points, obviously, on the long end, because we have completely ignored stochastic rates. We're completely overshooting on the long end, and we're off by 2% log normal vol. So we wanted to hit 19% implied log normal, and we get 21.2. OK, so we correct. Next time, we'll use the proxy up there, but on different targets, which we have corrected by just a difference. When we do that, second iteration, the error is now 0.1%. OK, so 10 basis points of log normal vol. So that's already pretty good. We do another one, and there's no error. OK, so 3 iterations were there. So that sounds pretty good. Notice as well that this is already multidimensional. We have found 10 unknown values for 10 targets in 3 iterations. And the number of iterations has not really been affected that much by the number of targets. We probably could do it with 20 targets, more granular. It would still be 3 iterations. We're going to see that we'll do it with a lot more than targets. You know, intuitively, how does it work? Correcting the target is a bit like correcting your proxy by the opposite amount. So if you think of this is a sort of an example in one dimensional. The blue curve is our function, and we want to find where it hits 0. But we only have a proxy, which is the red curve. So first, we solve the proxy for the 0, and we find the first estimate. And because we can calculate the error to the blue curve, we can shift our proxy up. And now, obviously, the red shifted is a lot closer than the real function. And after the second iteration, maybe I can point. Is that how you point? No, I don't know. That one. So after correction, the second target obviously much closer. Okay. For the interest of time, I think I'll skip that. The question is, well, what are the conditions for it to converge? I mean, you can think of this algorithm as a fixed point on the function h here, which is y plus m minus f of g inverse. And you look at the conditions for convergence. And effectively, what you find at the end for a good convergence is you need f and g inverse to be, combined. Combining the two will be roughly in identity, which is intuitive. So now let's talk about a real smile calibration. So in this case, we extend to 2 dimensions. We have a set of strikes and a set of expiries, and we want to do the same thing. We have observable implied vols, and now we want to calibrate a local volatility sigma of S and T to match those ones. Okay, so we want to go from implied to local. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So obviously, Dupire's formula does it. And you know, we were very happy with it for many years. But there are some issues with it. Obviously, it requires a fully interpolated set surface of implieds, and that creates challenges. In fact, we spend a lot more years trying to fix the the implied interpolation. And also, one thing that is an issue with that is you don't really have any control on the shape of the local vol. It will be non-parametric. It will be, you know, sometimes quite dependent on some interpolation tweaks, etc. And it could be unrealistic, etc. So very early on, we thought, well, wouldn't it be better to give ourselves a particular interpolation of the local vol and just calibrate to the observable points and nothing else? So going from local to implied and inverting. So in the time dimension and in the Black-Scholes framework, obviously implied vol is an average of local vols. Implied variance is an average of local variance across time. You know, intuitively we just need to do the same thing, but now across spot as well. You know, and would it be nice if the implied vol for a given strike is an average of the local vols across spot values, maybe from spot to strike? Okay, so there are a number of results. I'm very conscious about time as well. So obviously there are some results for small time expansions by Berestiki, Busca, Florent. And I'm going to skip that. We'll give some intuition about this. So what we see here is that the implied is effectively an harmonic average of the local vols. And this is true for small times. But this particular, so you could say, well, let's use that as a proxy. You know, I give myself some local vol. As a proxy, I'm just going to average them harmonically and then use that. So as an example, if we give ourselves a local vol in the blue curve here, and we say, let's compute some implied vol. And here we just take one expiry. Okay. The true target one, which is, you know, running an exact PD, would be the yellow curve. The harmonic average will be the red curve. Okay, so it has, for example, the disadvantage that it doesn't price any convexity. You know, the at-the-money one is just the same value as the local vol at-the-money, for example. So it's already, well, it gives you a little bit of the shape, but it's not very good. So there's been plenty of other work, and you know, I think I probably will do some injustice to some people because there's been so much work for specific types of local volatility. You know, you can do lots of things with CV, with separable and quadratic stuff, or you can make assumptions. I mean, a lot of the times you need to make some assumption of smoothness, for example, for the local vol. And that's not ideal because the local vol is already a derivative of an observable quantity. It's unlikely to be super smooth, and it doesn't need to be super smooth at all. Okay. So another approach, we use we use an equation that Bruno I think came up with. Can we say that? Yes. We certainly used it from many years ago. And basically, it relays the price of two options at two different volatilities. One would be sigma 0 volatility, and one would be sigma. And in my situation here, I'm just going to take sigma 0 and sigma being two deterministic functions, but it doesn't have to be like that. And in this case, given two surfaces, I can relate the two prices with this integral here. And you see that it's basically the expectation of the gamma times the difference of variances. Okay, and it's true for any option, but in particular, it's true for a call option. And if we choose carefully the sigma 0, because we can choose anything we want for sigma 0, let's say sigma is our true model. Let's take sigma 0 being a constant equal to the implied vol. We find that because the two prices have to be equal, and we can rearrange the equation, sigma implied can be written as this ratio of integrals. And if we continue expanding the integral, the expectations into densities, we find in the end that the implied is a sort of average of the variances, but the weights, which are here, are quite complicated. And it's an average across time and an average across spot. Okay? And that's been done a few times. I mean, I think Julien's done it also in one of his papers. And what you can show as well is that, well, so what you notice here is that in this one here, the gamma is the gamma that is calculated with the implied vol that we're looking for. So this equation already is a bit implicit. And then the density is the true density, which we don't know. Okay? But one thing you could do, there's many approximations you can do. You can do a lot of work around this. But a simple approximation is to say, well, let's replace the density that we don't know by the Black-Scholes density at that implied volatility, which we don't know yet, but let me carry on with that. And when you do that, it becomes a lot easier because now the gamma and the density are in the same assumptions, and there's lots of cancellations that happen, and effectively you can show that those weights are following a Brownian bridge, starting at the spot, finishing at the strike, and those weights can be displayed like that. So obviously more density around the spot, more density around the strike. So it tells you what are the points that matter when you average out the local vols into implied. Okay? And the equation starts looking a little better like this. And then you can do more work. I'm going to pass this. You can do more work, and ultimately you'll calculate those weights. So with some piecewise linear local vols, you can actually analytically work this out and discretize those integrals quite easily. In the end, you get your implied vol is an average of local vol with some weights. And because you want to actually invert the system, you can, because it's sort of, you've made it a linear system. And now you've got the locals are the inverse of this matrix of the implied. So now we've got a proxy to go from all these implied vols to a set of local vols. And those local vols are the breakpoints in my piecewise linear local vol.
What about the condition?
For the matrix to be well behaved?
Yeah.
Well, so obviously there's, well, I mean, it's effectively averaging. So, I mean, obviously you need the right dimensions, and what we do is we set the strikes, the breakpoints in the right place. But yeah, I mean, you could come up with situations where it doesn't work very well, but sometimes there is no solution. In fact, sometimes these implied vols cannot be attainable. So anyway, it works quite well. I mean, if you just notice, the proxy is a lot closer to our target. Okay. So I'm going to skip, and you can replace that averaging of variances by averaging of harmonics, and that works actually even better. So let's take an example. So we're going to use this proxy, and we're going to start from a number of targets. So now I'm looking at euro-dollar FX options. I'm using 9 tenors, 9 strikes. So I have 81 targets. And I invert that system once. That gives me some local vol. And then I put them into my pricer, my exact pricer, and I check the accuracy. So already it's not bad, because you see the worst error is 11.48% instead of 11%. Or 48 bips is already a good start. Okay. But what we're going to do now, we're going to turn on the fixed point iteration. If I'm 48 bips too high, I'm going to target 48 bips lower. And what we see, sorry for there's a lot of data in here, but hopefully I've put some colors. Red is bad, green is good. So we had a target of less than 2 bips accuracy, and we see that first iteration, the worst is 48 bips, followed by 11, followed by 1. You can see the local vol is quite nicely behaved, because we chose an interpolated local vol that we fully control. So you can choose piecewise linear. Here it's slightly smoother than that, but we completely control that form. And we have a perfect match after 3 iterations. Okay. it wouldn't be interesting if we stop here. It's going to be interesting when we turn on stochastic rates. So what we want here is obviously use it in a case where we don't have the full analytics. So for example, we take multi-factor Chariot model for interest rates in domestic currency and interest rate in foreign currency. And you can turn on a whole bunch of other things, stock vol as well on the FX. And basically make sure you're in a case where you don't have analytics anymore, okay? Or even decent proxy. But we're going to do exactly the same thing, and we're going to keep the same proxy, the same exact proxy. So what we find now is that, okay, it takes one more iteration, okay? And we see that the first iteration, we misestimate the smile quite a bit because we didn't have stochastic rates in the proxy, so we are overshooting by a lot. And we're overshooting by 90 bips. But very quickly after one iteration, we're back at 46 bips. So it's pretty good. Third iteration, 12 bips. And fourth iteration, 4 bips. So basically with one more iteration, we turned on a very complicated model and do as well as a simple local vol model. But the key is obviously you need a very, very fast Monte Carlo to do that. So Monte Carlo would be probably sub-second, just below a second. So this would take about 4 or 5 seconds. I'm running out of time. So I'll show you a couple of other results. We can use the proxy. We can also do PD proxy, and that would work just as well. And I'll give you another example where with a PD proxy, we get actually the same answer in 3 iterations. That's the local vol that you get from it. It works just the same for an equity case here. The smile has a different shape, but it works just the same. And it works for dollar yen as well, although there are some interesting situations to discuss when there actually is no solution. And if we had more time, we could look into that. I think I don't have more time. Yeah. Maybe. If you want to take a couple of questions. Yeah, I'll just mention one more thing is that we want something that is parametric here. So we give ourselves a parameterized local vol, and we want to control it. But in fact, you can really push the problem to a very, very large number of parameters. So here, and I'll finish with that, I have 60 terms that I calibrate to, and 9 strikes per term. And I still hit the results in 5 iterations, 2 bips accuracy on everything. So actually, I'm almost non-parametric if you'd like. I mean, I can really have a very fine calibration of my smile. Well, I think I'll stop here, take some questions.
So we do have time for a couple of quick questions, 1 or 2. So does anyone have a burning one? Okay.
A bit related to my question this morning. So when you put, this Xi, which includes, some specific stochasticity in your, how does that impact? Because I suppose that you do that eventually to price exotic options, whether it's variance swaps, it's barrier options, etc. So how does the volatility of the Xi impact not only the price, but also the hedge ratios with vanillas?
Yeah. I mean, so the first thing I'll say is that here I've chosen to calibrate only the local volatility given everything else, okay? And I like to do that because I start from the principle that if I have a given smile, I have so many models that can effectively calibrate to it.
Xi is one of the inputs.
So Xi is the input of your model. That's try to feed the signal so that that's exactly. But first comment is that the fixed point algorithm, and that's what I was doing in 2001, you could apply it to more than just a local vol. You could also put the stock vol in there. But also, the point is that a given smile is not going to give you the stock vol. So you'll have to estimate the stock vol in other ways, maybe look at history of actual movements of volatility, which would be, I mean, there's lots of different ways. But this is just a technique to illustrate how you could use the fixed point to calibrate whichever parameter you choose to calibrate, in this case, the local vol. Because often you'll want maybe the stock vol to be a best fit, but there are lots of advantages of having an exact fit to a chosen number of observables. Even if you don't believe in all of them, but here the idea is that if you only believe in 5 strikes, for example, this is the only ones that are really observable, you cannot calibrate to only 5 strikes.
Okay, well, let's thank Guillaume again, and we'll take some more questions at the end of the session.
Thank you.